Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich heiße Ludwig-Christian Schröder und bin der wissenschaftliche Leiter des Instituts für Ostrecht. Wir freuen uns, Sie hier in den Räumen des Instituts für Ostrecht München begrüßen zu können. Das Institut existiert schon 50 Jahre. Wir haben 1957 in München angefangen bis zum Jahre 2007 und sind dann hier nach Regensburg übergewechselt. Deswegen dieser etwas oszillierende Name Institut für Ostrecht München / Regensburg. Und eigentlich sollte, Sie sind nur hier, weil der Saal unten renoviert wird, unser Hauptsaal, aber das ist eigentlich eine List der Vernunft, denn Sie sind hier genau richtig, weil das Institut für Ostrecht befasst sich, wie der Name sagt, mit den Rechtsproblemen Osteuropas und heute, der Vortrag wird ja zum großen Teil Rechtsprobleme behandeln. Deswegen möchte ich nichts weiter dazu sagen. Herr Brunbauer wird noch etwas sagen, aber vielleicht kann dieses Kennenlernen des Instituts dazu dienen, dass Sie auch in Zukunft gelegentlich den Weg zu uns finden. Herr Professor Küpper ist ja Spezialist für ungarisches Recht, einer der ganz wenigen Spezialisten in Deutschland. Wenn Sie also nähere Auskünfte haben, sind Sie bei ihm immer in besten Händen. Dankeschön.
Ja, Herr Schröder, herzlichen Dank für die Gastfreundschaft. Es wurde auch höchste Zeit, dass wir einmal eine Veranstaltung hier in den Räumlichkeiten des Instituts für Ostrecht auch durchführen, geschuldet einerseits diesem unglücklichen Umstand der Renovierung unseres Veranstaltungsraums, aber vor allem dem glücklichen Umstand, dass ja das Institut für Ostrecht eine der beteiligten Einrichtungen der Graduiertenschule für Ost- und Südosteuropastudien ist, und diese heutige Veranstaltung wird ja von der Graduiertenschule im Rahmen ihres Forum-Moduls organisiert, also das heißt im Rahmen jenes Moduls, in dem wir versuchen, Veranstaltungen, die die aktuelle politische, soziale Lage des östlichen Europas zu thematisieren, hier zu organisieren. Und da freut es mich ganz besonders, einen ausgewiesenen Kenner der und Verfassungsproblematik Ungarns hier gewonnen zu haben für den heutigen Vortrag, Gábor Attila Tóth, der von Kollegen Küpper dann auch noch ausführlicher vorgestellt wird, von Juristen zu Juristen sozusagen. Ich möchte mit einem kurzen Hinweis noch schließen, dass die heutige Veranstaltung wird nicht nur von der Graduiertenschule organisiert, sondern auch von der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft, die über eine Zweigstelle in Regensburg, deren Leitung ich über habe, mitveranstaltet. Herr Küpper, das ist eine weitere Parallelität, ist ja auch eng mit der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft als Leiter ihres wissenschaftlichen Beirats verbunden, und insofern können wir beide Sie im Namen dieser beiden Einrichtungen, der Graduiertenschule einerseits und der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft und natürlich dann auch dem Institut für Ostrecht heute herzlich willkommen heißen für einen Vortrag, der, glaube ich, auch für Nichtjuristen sehr interessant zu werden verspricht. Und warum er interessant werden wird, das wird uns Herr Küpper noch besser erörtern können, als ich als Nichtjurist das tun könnte.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Jetzt kriegen Sie noch ein paar einleitende Worte von mir. 3 Vorworte auf einmal. Das ist, wenn man jetzt mal in etwas älteren Kategorien denkt, eine Planübererfüllung von mindestens 150%. Ja, ich darf auch hier begrüßen Herrn Tóth, Herrn Professor Tóth, Professor an der Universität Debrecen in Ostungarn, Leiter des Lehrstuhls für Verfassungsrecht. Er war viele Jahre lang wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter des ungarischen Verfassungsgerichts, hat studiert in Budapest, dann später in Miskolc promoviert, unterrichtet an mehreren ungarischen Einrichtungen über Verfassungsrecht, aber auch über Bioethik, also ein sehr vielseitiges wissenschaftliches, pädagogisches Betätigungsfeld, war auch in Berlin am Institute for Advanced Studies, war 2008 der Kandidat des Staatspräsidenten für das Amt des mittlerweile nicht mehr existierenden Ombudsmanns oder Ombudsperson, ist auch in Deutschland nicht ganz unbekannt, da er als Stipendiat des DAAD an der Humboldt-Universität in Berlin war, allerdings auch in Oxford und Warschau, also weit gereist, und ist Mitglied der öffentlichen Körperschaft der Ungarischen Akademie der Wissenschaften. Und warum die ungarische Verfassung im Moment so ein spannendes Thema ist, das erzählt Ihnen, glaube ich, Herr Tóth besser selber. Dann viel Spaß beim Vortrag.
Dankeschön. Professor Schröder, Professor Brunbauer, Professor Küpper, dear colleagues, thanks for inviting me, and thanks Heidrun Hamerski for the valuable help before the lecture. I am happy to be here, and I can say that the constitutional situation in Hungary is not pleasant, but I am pleased to be here and to speak about the Hungarian developments and to discuss the details with you. So I have some slides on the screen, and I have a written presentation, not more than 50 minutes. I try to connect them. Soon after the 2010 general elections, the Hungarian parliament adopted a proclamation on the statement of national cooperation. This proclamation declares, I quote, "After 46 years of occupation and 20 confused years of transition, Hungary has regained the right and power of self-determination. In spring 2010, the Hungarian nation gathered its strength once again and brought about a successful revolution in the polling booth. Parliament declares that it recognizes and will respect this constitutional revolution. Parliament declares that in April's election, a new social contract was born. The pillars of our common future will be work, home, family, health, and order." A couple of days later, a governmental ordinance was published which made it compulsory for the proclamation to be prominently displayed in governmental buildings. If you visit Hungary these days, you will notice the statement of national cooperation not only in governmental buildings, but also in state-run hospitals, museums, schools, and sport properties. In the name of this proclamation, the two-thirds parliamentary majority changed the 1989 constitution 15 times within a year, including a reduction of the constitutional court's competencies. Moreover, in April 2011, on the first anniversary of the 2010 elections, the head of the state promulgated a brand new constitution called the Fundamental Law. Since 2011, this new constitution has already been amended 5 times, changing around 20% of the original text of the Fundamental Law. The constitutional transformation has attracted the attention of scholars, politicians, media, and the general public, both at home and abroad. While it is the first newly made constitution to originate from a democratically elected parliament in Hungary, the way the text was drafted, as well as the content of the text itself, according to many observers, are in conflict with some of the basic features of democratic constitutionalism. By reading this proclamation, several questions may arise. What does 20 confused years of transition refer to? What does revolution in polling booth mean? What is social contract based upon work, home, family, health, and order? Ultimately, what is the new fundamental law for? The objective of my presentation is to describe how the constitutional transitions are altering the basic structure of the Hungarian state. I first briefly outline the constitutional background of the 1989 revolutionary transition in East Central Europe with a focus on Hungary. Second, I show why Hungary became an anomaly in the region and how the flexible constitution and the hostile political climate have challenged its constitutional stability. Third, I interpret the result of the 2010 parliamentary elections and describe the flow of the controversial constitutional changes, including the limitation of the competencies of the Constitutional Court immediately after the 2010 elections. And fourth, I review the process of the adoption of the new fundamental law. And finally, painting with a broad brush, I introduce the main features of the new constitution and its amendments. The Hungarian constitutional transformation is a particular story, but it is of European relevance. Therefore, I not only examine what the Hungarians have achieved or failed to achieve, but implicitly also call attention to what modern societies can learn from the Hungarian story. A quarter century ago, East Central European countries, including the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, were communist regimes that could be characterized by a single party system, for example, Hungary and Romania, or a dominant party system, for example, Czechoslovakia or Poland, without the possibility of competitive elections. The common feature of these states, like any other communist countries, was chronic shortage. An economy of shortage instead of a market economy, a budget deficit instead of a balanced budget, and the lack of democratic institutions rather than a constitutional democracy. Although constitutions formally declared fundamental rights, these were not legally enforceable. The constitutional structures of these states were not based upon the principles of separation of powers and the rule of law. Moreover, the states did not ensure the independence of the judiciary or the press. And of course, non-governmental organizations were forced by the repressive regimes to work underground. The historical turning point for the transformation from authoritarian regime to democracy was 1989. With the exception of only Romania, the dismantling of the communist regime proceeded peacefully, involving at some point roundtable negotiations between delegates of the state party and those of the opposition in the making. Timothy Garton Ash described the events with the expression revolution, combining the term of reform and revolution. Other authors labeled the developments as coordinated transition or negotiated revolution. Moreover, the dissolution of the federal state of Czechoslovakia and the establishment of the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, which took place in 1993, is often mentioned as Velvet Divorce, a reference to the term Velvet Revolution that was used internationally to describe the 1989 revolutions. These classifications all express that the Central European single-party systems didn't collapse due to a classical revolution, but through negotiations and compromises between the old regime and the democratic opposition. However, the political transition did result in revolutionary changes in the political and constitutional system, and did so without a revolution as such. In his new evaluation, Timothy Garton Ash presupposes that the peaceful negotiated regime changes in Central Europe, together with the unification of Germany and disintegration of the Soviet Union, established a new model of non-violent revolution. The ideal type of classical revolution is, I quote, violent, utopian, class-based, and characterized by a progressive radicalization culminating in terror. The 1989 ideal type, by contrast, is non-violent, anti-utopian, based on broad social coalitions and characterized by an application of mass social pressure to bring the current power holders to negotiate. It culminates not in terror, but in compromise. If the totem of 89 type revolution is the guillotine, that of 1989 is the round table. The quote ends. The negotiations was a process led not by the common interest of the parties, but by a clash of values and interest, in which both parties, the communists and the democratic movements, were compelled to make compromises. We can say that the demand to reach compromises is one of the underlying characteristics of peaceful transitions. The Hungarian Constitutional Court called this a revolution under the rule of law. Due to negotiated transitions, the East Central European countries became modern constitutional democracies. Since the models of the reshaped constitutions were international human rights instruments, as well as the more recent Western constitutions, they were written in the language of modern constitutionalism. Members of the legislature are selected through periodically held free elections. The vast majority of the nation's adult population has the right to vote, regardless of race, gender, or property ownership. The state's constitutions contain enforceable legal provisions rather than a collection of mere good wishes. The purpose of constitutions are seen as limiting the authority of state power. Each of these constitutions recognizes and protects judicial independence, freedom of the press, and the right to establish civil associations. There are constitutional courts, or in Poland, a tribunal that safeguards the constitutional values and principles and strike down unconstitutional laws. Judicial protection of the Constitution in all countries is closer to the centralized German model than the diffuse United States judicial review. The new Central European democracies followed Western European traditions in establishing a parliamentary system instead of importing a United States presidential architecture. This was true in Hungary, since the non-violent but drastic changes in 1989 created political and legal institutions similar to those already existing in the established liberal democracies. The most crucial element of the substantively new Hungarian constitution were promulgated on the 33rd anniversary of the 1956 revolution, 2 weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. These amendments created the legal frameworks of the new democracy that can be characterized by the main institutions of constitutionalism: representative government, a parliamentary system, an independent judiciary, ombudsman to guard fundamental rights, and the constitutional court to review the laws for their constitutionality. The Hungarian constitution copied the German chancellor-led system, including a weak president elected by the parliamentary representatives. The 1989 and the 1990 constitutional amendments made it clear that the prime minister heads the executive and the government is the supreme body of that branch responsible to the parliament. Since 1990, the Hungarian Constitutional Court has been considered to be the safeguard of fundamental rights and an institutional guarantee of the separation of powers. As in other Central and Eastern European countries, the Constitutional Court was institutionally separated from the ordinary court system and had unique erga omnes constitutional interpretive authority. Despite some shortcomings, the Constitutional Court was the most important institution in maintaining the constitutional balance of powers. Now I am talking Hungarian failure. A Hungarian failure because this is the only nation in the region that didn't adopt an entirely new constitution after the fall of communism. Substantially, the constitution was modern and democratic due to the above-mentioned modifications. In formal terms, however, the 1989 constitution was a mere modification of the Stalinist 1949 constitution. The roundtables didn't actually have a mandate for constitution making. They had no formal authorization to make law for the old regime, nor did they have popular authorization to make law for the new regime. János Kis argues that the roundtables understood their task to be limited to facilitating the run-up to free, competitive elections. The agreements were meant to regulate the transition from an old regime to the new regime. Consequently, the roundtables were exceptional bodies having the capacity to start a coordinated process of constitutional change, but leaving the completion of the process to an assembly with the democratic mandate they were lacking. János Kis characterizes the constitutional making profile of the Velvet Revolutions as consisting of 2 stages. In the first stage, a roundtable agreement determines the ground rules of preparing and holding free elections. The second stage takes place when a body of freely elected representatives adopts, in the sovereign people's name, a new constitution. In the aftermath of the Polish Roundtable Agreement, the old constitution was amended in April 1989, and the first democratic parliament then reshaped the relations between the legislative and executive branches of the state. This was the so-called small constitution. The reformed constitution was finally replaced in 1997 by a completely new constitution for Poland. The old constitution of Czechoslovakia was also amended in 1989. The Charter of Fundamental Rights and Basic Freedoms was incorporated in 1991. After the dissolution of the federal state, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic adopted a new constitution in 1992. In Bulgaria and Romania, the second step was made in 1991. By contrast, Hungary is the only nation that didn't adopt a formally new constitution. It is true, as I mentioned, that like other countries in the region, the peaceful, coordinated political transition resulted in revolutionary outcomes. Democratic institutions replaced an authoritarian regime. Pluralistic society replaced the dominance of communist ideology. Since the transition, the constitution has been amended several times, including a modification in 2004 that empowered Hungary to join the European Union. However, Hungary didn't accomplish the symbolic mission. It failed to adopt a constitution which would have demonstrated a successful finish of the democratic transition. Why? Surprisingly, compared to those of other European states, the Hungarian constitution was easy to amend. The constitution didn't render any provision or principle unamendable. That is to say, there was no Ewigkeits clause in the Hungarian constitution. And it required only the votes of 2/3 of members of a single-chamber parliament. Despite the fact that the constitution couldn't be modified or amended by the ordinary lawmaking procedure according to a simple majority rule, it was regarded as relatively flexible rather than rigid because one legislative body had the sole power to change the constitutional text. Neither a referendum nor any other form of ratification, for example, approval by the subsequent parliament, was required for the adoption of a new constitution or a constitutional amendment. Certainly, Hungary made its attempt to bring the post-communist constitution-making process to a conclusion. Prior to 2010, there was one period between 1994 and 1998 when the government was supported by 2/3 of the seats in parliament. Even though, on a number of issues, the then ruling parties failed to seek the consent of the opposition regarding certain acts requiring a 2/3 majority, the governing coalition also expressed some willingness to cooperate with the opposition in constitution making. They modified the procedural guarantees of the constitution to the effect that Parliament should decide by a 4/5 majority in the preparatory process on the cornerstones of the new constitution. Because of the hostile political environment and the divergent constitutional conceptions, however, the talks in the constitution-making process collapsed in 1997, in the same year when Poland adopted its brand new constitution. The ideas of the rival political parties regarding the legal frameworks of the political community were diffuse enough to prevent a consensus on a brand new constitution. This is why, although the 1989 constitution was amended several times, the conception of fundamental rights and the basic structure of the state under the 1989 constitution remained untouched until 2010. Let me add that the 2/3 rule and the ad hoc 4/5 procedural amendment represent a theoretical consideration. According to this, in order to govern the state properly, the simple parliamentary majority does not need to reshape the constitutional architecture or limit fundamental rights. The requirement of a qualified majority are supposed to function as a control over the governing majority in power. It seems to be an exceptional guarantee to protect constitutionalism in Hungary. However, it makes the constitutional balance fragile. Intense cooperation between the parliamentary parties and their strong commitment toward constitutional values are necessary to modernize the constitution. Without such a consensus, there is a risk that the constitution could become the victim of an overwhelming governing majority. Now I am turning to the revolution in the polling booth and the flow of modification of the 1989 constitution. As you may know, Hungary's latest parliamentary election, the sixth since the 1990 founding elections, took place in April 2010. In this election, the then opposition party Fidesz won by a landslide, gaining a majority of 68% of the seats with 53% of the votes. You should know that Hungary had a mixed electoral system, majoritarian and proportionate elements, single-member districts and party lists. A party could secure 2/3 of the parliamentary seats with a little more than 50% of the votes. And it was a majority sufficiently large to amend the constitution or rewrite it totally. Both were to happen. During the election, the necessity of a new constitution was not on the agenda. However, very soon after the 2010 elections, the new prime minister announced that he would provide a brand new constitution for the nation. As a first step, he initiated the parliament, and the parliament adopted the proclamation on the statement of national cooperation, which I quoted at the beginning of this lecture. Moreover, in the first 1.5 years of its term, the parliamentary majority adopted a range of constitutional amendments. Now I summarize the most significant elements of those modifications. As regards the representative organs, soon after the opening sitting of the newly elected parliament, a symbolic constitutional amendment was adopted to reduce the number of parliamentary deputies. Hungary had a 386-seat parliament, while under the new rules, the number of members of the next parliament will be not more than 200. Parliament also reduced the number of local government representatives. On a local level, the parliamentary majority modified the substantive and procedural rules of the elections and significantly reshaped the boundaries of the electoral constituencies. Local government elections were held based upon these new provisions in October 2010. Several analysts welcomed these changes as a first step toward a low-cost, productive, and good governance. Critics, however, warned against rising populist and anti-parliamentarian sentiments. So as to achieve a law and order in society, a new constitutional provision was adopted. According to this, court secretaries, lawyers without judicial appointment, may rule on cases within the competence of local courts concerning the detention of those committing minor offenses. As a result of the new rule, not only judges could decide in legal disputes. Moreover, the court secretaries got the competence to rule on deprivation of personal liberty. According to several proponents, this modification helps the courts speed up civil and criminal procedures. Critics, on the other side, argued that habeas corpus and other civil liberties should be curtailed by judicial decisions only. Media law. A brand new constitutional provisions on freedom of expression have been adopted by Parliament. It established a powerful media authority dealing with telecommunication and broadcasting, providing this with a constitutional status and giving a competence for the head of the authority to issue decrees which are binding to everyone. The head of the authority was appointed by the Prime Minister for a term of 9 years which ensured that the government had a solid influence on the performance of the media authority. On the basis of the constitutional amendment, the legislature adopted acts relating to content regulation, procedures and sanctions. The competence of the new body is not limited to regulating and controlling broadcast media, but also supervises the print and internet outlets. The Parliament adopted a constitutional amendment on retroactive tax obligation, which permitted the legislature to tax retroactively incomes received from public funds, from pensions and salaries of public sector workers to extra bonuses for former high-ranking government officials. The aim of the new amendment was to create an exception to the prohibition of ex post facto laws and the constitutional limits of taxation established by the Constitutional Court. Based upon the new provisions, an act was adopted concerning a 98% tax on public sector severance pay above a certain sum of money. It was to be applied to public sector employees who left their jobs after 1st January 2010. The Constitutional Court declared this act unconstitutional. In the Court's view, although the constitutional amendment paved the way for the legislature to introduce special taxes on certain incomes, 98% seemed to be a confiscatory tax and was therefore contrary even to the newly enacted article of the Constitution. This decision and its precedents were inspired by the Bundesverfassungsgerichtshof's decision on konfiskatorische Steuer. Shortly after the court ruling, the parliamentary majority launched a new version of the constitutional amendment, allowing any income from public funds exceeding a certain threshold to be taxed retroactively up to 5 years. The modification of the constitutional rules on taxation in order to override a settled constitutional case law were not the first steps in limiting the Constitutional Court. After the opening sitting of the newly elected parliament, the majority changed the constitutional regulation of the constitutional justices' nomination process. Previously, the members of the Constitutional Court had been nominated by a special committee consisting of one member of each parliamentary faction and elected by a two-thirds majority of the plenum. Under the new rule, the constitutional justices can be nominated by a parliamentary committee whose members are appointed from and by the parties according to their share of seats in parliament. Consequently, even in the nomination process, there is no longer a need for consensus. The parliamentary majority is able to nominate candidates without working together with the opposition. Moreover, in 2011, there was one more amendment to the old constitution. This amendment enlarged the court's membership from 11 to 15, adding up to 4 justices to the bench. In sum, 7 new justices were elected by the governing majority within 1 year due to vacancies. And finally, when the Constitutional Court declared the 1980% tax unconstitutional, the ruling coalition responded by adopting a constitutional amendment that removed some part of the Constitutional Court competencies. The new regulation excludes, with extremely limited exceptions, the possibility of a constitutional review regarding financial and tax measures. And last but not least, in 2010, the governing majority used its two-thirds vote to remove the constitutional rule requiring a 4/5 vote to approve the cornerstones of the new constitution. Andrew Arato and other constitutional scholars argued that this provision was unchangeable this way. He says that one cannot change by 2/3, but only 4/5 can change. Despite criticism, the Constitutional Court approved the abolition of the 4/5 rule. Consequently, the Parliament managed to suspend key constitutional checks on legislation and facilitated a constitution drafting process that could proceed without opposition involvement. Those who advocated the flow of constitutional modifications emphasized that procedurally it was okay because people empowered the governing majority to correct the constitution. According to the proponents, the constitutional modifications are appropriate substantially too, because those represent a well-funded attempt to modernize Hungarian legal system by responding several alarming legal and political challenges. The opponents of this kind of constitutional legislation, however, warned that we have witnessed is nothing special but the usual activity of a rising authoritarian regime, degrading parliament as a representative and deliberative body, attacking independent judiciary, limiting the constitutional court, curtailing freedom of the press and other civil liberties, are well-known, alarming indicators of a developing autocratic government. And here is the procedure of the constitution making. The above-mentioned constitutional changes were only the first steps in a greater development. Most of the constitutional amendments, in fact, served a temporary goal. In the name of the 2010 revolution, the ruling coalition started to work on a new constitution. It argued that the period of post-communist transformation should draw to a close, and for this reason, Hungary needed a new constitution. The Prime Minister personally established an advisory council and named its members to elaborate a draft. In addition, the Parliament set up a special parliamentary ad hoc committee to develop the regulatory frameworks of the new constitution. Although at the outset all the parliamentary parties were represented in this committee, the opposition quit immediately after the Constitutional Court's competence was seen to be curbed. Within a couple of months, the remaining committee had completed its preparatory task and published the regulatory framework of the Constitution of Hungary. Subsequently, Parliament discussed this regulatory framework and decided that the document was no longer seen as determining the direction of framing the Constitution, but served as a material in support of the constitution-making work. Finally, the ruling coalition set up a three-member panel of politicians instead of the parliamentary committee to draft the text of the new constitution. To lend the constitution writing process legitimacy, a national consultation body was set up with the aim of sending a questionnaire to every citizen of Hungary. The questionnaire was composed of 12 issues, including, among others, the relation between fundamental rights and obligations, the restriction of public debt, the role of the family, public order, labor and health, the need for extra votes for mothers as a proxy for their children, the ban on imposing taxes on the expenses related to child rearing, the protection of future generations, the togetherness of Hungarians living within and beyond the state borders, the protection of natural diversity and national treasures, the protection of land and water, the need to include life imprisonment into the Constitution. According to unaudited data, approximately 900,000 citizens, less than 10% of the Hungarian citizens, have filled in and sent back the questionnaires. The answers were in the middle of being processed when the draft new constitution was submitted to the parliament. On March 2011, the draft text of the new fundamental law was released. The parliamentary agenda ensured 5 days for the plenary debate about the concept and 4 days about the details. That meant 9 days from the start to finish. The far-right Jobbik participated, the left-wing opposition and the Greens didn't take part in this process. The date of promulgation, April 25, was chosen to identify the fundamental law with the first anniversary of the election victory. It entered into force on January 1st, 2012. According to the government and several scholars, the constitution-making procedure should be seen as formally legal and legitimate achievement of a democratically elected parliament. In the critics' view, the procedure is a failure because of the lack of transparency and insufficient dialogue with the opposition, as well as lack of professional and open public debate and the hastiness of the constitution-making procedure. Let me say something about the content of the new fundamental law. First, the ideology. The fundamental law, and especially of its preamble, called the National Avowal or National Creed, changes the characteristics of the Hungarian constitutionalism. The 1989 constitution established a secular state based upon a pluralistic society. The leading principles were liberty, equality, and democracy. Contrary to this, in my view, the fundamental law finds its foundations in religious and historical considerations rather than in the notion of ideological neutrality. This is what the reference to Saint Stephen and the Holy Crown of Saint Stephen implies. We are proud that 1,000 years ago, our King Saint Stephen established the Hungarian state on solid foundations and led our country to become part of Christian Europe. And, I quote again, we acknowledge the nation-preserving role of the Christian faith. The National Avowal explicitly mentions the Holy Crown, which embodies the constitutional continuity of the state and the unity of the nation. The proponents of the Constitution repeatedly mentioned that the Polish Constitution as a model of the fundamental law. It is well known that the Polish Constitution refers to Christianity. However, I believe the social facts and the constitutional norms in Poland are seen to be different from those in Hungary. As opposed to Hungary, Poland remains one of the most religious countries in Europe. 89% of the population belongs to the Roman Catholic Church, and more than half of the population goes to church. Yet, the Polish constitution treats believers and non-believers as equals. The Polish text says, "Those who believe in God as the source of truth, justice, good, and beauty, and as well as those not sharing such faith but respecting those universal values as arising from other sources, equal in rights and obligations, and our culture is rooted in the Christian heritage of the nation and in universal human values." Hungarian citizens are divided by ethical, political, and religious disagreements. According to a recent poll, 44% of Hungarians answered that they believed there is a God, 31% answered that they believed there is some sort of spirit of life force, and 19% answered that they are atheists. Meanwhile, more than half of the population belongs to the Roman Catholic Church and 20% of the citizens are Protestant, but only 10% are churchgoers and follow religious norms. In contrast with the Polish constitution, however, the Hungarian fundamental law doesn't mention the role of universal secular values or those who respect such values. In this way, it doesn't simply remember the historical role of Christianity in founding the Hungarian state, but expresses that the Hungarian constitutionalism present is based upon one of the traditional Christian faiths. Consequently, it identifies itself with the moral and political foundations of a certain faith. The history. The preamble of the fundamental law is full of historical references. Nevertheless, the text does not mention the republican traditions or look back on the tragic failures of the nation, but negates the post-communist era. In the sense of the fundamental law, 1989 was a beginning of confusion, and the real revolutionary year is 2010 because of the result of the parliamentary elections. Perhaps it is not an exaggeration to say that the preamble is a mythical and romantic account of history. It is worth comparing this to the historical narrative of the Polish constitution, which represents a reflective and critical view by stating that the country recovered in 1989 and is mindful of the bitter experiences of the times when fundamental freedoms and human rights were violated in our homeland. About the integrative functions of the Constitution. One of the crucial judgments on the fundamental law is that it doesn't fulfill the integrative function of modern constitutions. It is biased in favor of the winners of the 2010 elections and against everybody else. It provides a mythical historical narrative that goes against the grain of Republican traditions. It prefers some believers to non-believers and followers of other faiths. Of course, Hungary is not exceptional in being a disunited nation. For an important analogy, the so-called red, the Republican, and blue, democratic political cultures deeply divide the people of the United States of America. In Northern Ireland, nationalists and unionists disagree about no less than under which state, the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland, the country's territory should be governed. In Belgium, the Flemish and Walloon communities not only speak different languages, but are unable to find a common political language. Every modern political society with a plurality of moral convictions, worldviews, and interests must face the question of whether there are principles that all the parties can share, notwithstanding of their deep disagreements. If there are, what kind of institutional design can help to implement their common political and constitutional goals? In this respect, the Hungarian case provides sad lessons on the consequences of a delusive constitutional majoritarianism. Moreover, the fundamental law does not identify the people with citizens as subjects of the same legal system. It rather insists that there is, I quote, one single Hungarian nation that belongs together, a nation including all ethnic Hungarians regardless of their habitual residence and effective link to the state. According to the fundamental law, the nation was torn apart in the storm of the last century. This refers to the historical Hungary as believed to be existed in the Middle Ages, and certainly to those neighboring territories where some 2.5 million Hungarians are still living today as a consequence of the post-World War treaties of 1920 and 1947. Therefore, Hungarians living beyond the borders are treated by the fundamental law as members of a nation disunited by the international legal and political order. The constitution that identifies the nation as an intellectual and spiritual constitutional community can be understood as a descendant of the East Central European nationalist ideas and movements from the last 2 centuries. The fundamental law transforms the independence and the competencies of the Constitutional Court. First, the previously changed nomination rules concerning the members of the court are maintained. The governing majority has absolute freedom to nominate and elect judges. With regard to the election process, the president of the court will no longer be elected by his fellow justices, but by parliamentary majority. Second, while the fundamental law retains most of the competencies of the court, changes are considerable. Previously, every person was entitled to take action for constitutional review against a normative act after its enactment. Now, the ex post review of unconstitutionality of legislation is restricted since the fundamental law abolishes this kind of actio popularis. In addition, the limitation of the court's competencies connected with financial matters has been maintained. The fundamental law, however, introduces a German-type constitutional complaint, making it possible to complain not only against a normative act, but also against the violation of a fundamental right through a court decision. the institutional design is subject to a number of criticisms. Checks and balances seem illusory because people who occupy crucial positions can be appointed for extraordinarily long terms by the current majority. Offices like the head of the state, the chief public prosecutor, the president of the Supreme Court, the president of the National Judicial Office, the head of the Budget Council, the head of the State of Audit Office, constitutional judges, the president of the National Media and Communication Authority are being filled by the current government. And about the fundamental rights, the catalogue of fundamental rights has been partly built on the structure of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. However, there are several provisions that raise serious concerns and controversies. Here are some examples. Freedom of press is not formulated as a subjective right, but as a protective obligation of the state. The fundamental law doesn't treat same-sex couples as equals. Family and marriage are, by definition, a parent-child connection and a relationship between a man and a woman. The text lacks any mention of the prohibition of discrimination on the ground of sexual orientation. Not only reproductive but also therapeutic cloning of human embryos is prohibited. While the fundamental law doesn't prohibit capital punishment, it allows compulsory life imprisonment without parole. The right to asylum is granted only, I quote, if neither their country of origin nor another country provides protection for the asylum seeker. Finally, as a consequence of the new constitutional regulation, more than 300 religious communities lost their church status, while only about 30 churches were legally recognized. And I also have a slide about the amendments to the fundamental law. So as to save some time, I won't go into the details. Needless to say that constitution makers believed that the fundamental law can be a solid and long-lasting foundation of the new Hungarian state. This idea became illusory, according to my estimation. So one of the closing provisions of the fundamental law stated that a transitional provision should be adopted. And based on this authorization, the Parliament adopted in December 2011 a so-called transitional provisions to the fundamental law. However, it contained not only transitory norms, but also retrospective ex post facto laws and substantive amendments to the fundamental law. Later, the Parliament adopted the first amendment, which guaranteed the stability of the former head of the state's payment. As you may know, the head of the state, Paul Schmidt, had to resign because of a plagium scandal. The second amendment, which was adopted in November 2012, tried to regulate the compulsory voter registration system. A month later, the third amendment was adopted, which declared that the act on the national resources, on the land, water, plants, and so on, should be adopted by the two-thirds vote of the members of the parliament. And surprisingly, the Hungarian Constitutional Court declared some part of the transitory provisions unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court declared the second amendment on compulsory voter registration as unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court also declared some other acts of the Parliament unconstitutional because they were not integrated into the text, into the original text of the fundamental law. They were not united to the text of the fundamental law, but violated some principles of rules of the fundamental law. And the parliament reacted soon, adopted the Fourth Amendment with several provisions, and curtailed against the Constitutional Court's competencies, and incorporated some unconstitutional norms into the original text of the Constitution. And this time, the former head of the state and the first president of the Constitutional Court, László Sólyom, wrote an article by saying that this is the end of the rule of law and separation of powers in Hungary. And my observation is that the system of the fundamental law is not stable at this moment because of the amendments. And my conclusions are as follows. The 1989 Constitution was based on the principle of liberal democracy and rule of law. However, Hungary was the only nation in the region that didn't adopt a brand new constitution after the democratic transition. The flexible constitution, the hostile political climate, and the erosion of the political culture have challenged the constitutional stability. In 2010, 2011, the ruling government has used its two-thirds parliamentary majority to adopt several constitutional changes concerning the representative organs, the media, and the Constitutional Court. The fundamental law alters the Hungarian secular constitutional system and weakens the institutional checks and balances. As I remarked, there was no political consensus about the necessity of constitutional making, nor about the content of the new constitution. And although the current constitutional power is far from the pre-1989 communist regimes, the similarities between the current system and the previous autocratic systems, the pre-1989 communist regimes and the pre-Second World War regimes, are essential too. So the constitutional crisis is a consequence of the shortage of democratic traditions and the failed collective historical self-examination. Exceptionally in Central Europe, the text of the fundamental law represents a winner-takes-all concept. Therefore, the new constitution does not unite and integrate, but divides the political community. This is why I can conclude that Hungary is a constitutionally disunited nation. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Tóth, thank you very much for your very interesting speech. In Germany, you have been able to read a lot and hear a lot about Hungarian politics, also about Hungarian constitution in the last years. So thank you very much for enlightening us about some of the scandals we heard about, showing us some others which the German media have not yet talked about so much. Vielleicht noch ein Wort zum Programm. Wir haben draußen für Sie ein wenig zu essen und zu trinken. Unsere Idee war, dass wir jetzt erst noch ein bisschen Diskussion machen und Sie danach zu einem kleinen Empfang einladen. Wenn Sie jetzt Fragen, Anmerkungen und so weiter haben, the floor is yours.
Wir verwenden das Mikrofon aufgrund der Aufnahme, nicht weil der Raum so groß wäre. And I have a question as for the terminology. Why is the Constitution called fundamental law? So I, of course, don't know the Hungarian expressions and whether there is an important semantic difference between constitution in Hungarian and fundamental law. Of course, one could say the German constitution is also called fundamental law, but for very peculiar historical reasons in 1949, which you actually would not like to repeat today. So what was the reason why the Hungarian government or the majority in the parliament decided to call this thing fundamental law instead of constitution?
It is a very interesting question. As far as I know, there is no official answer to your question. But I agree with you that the situation is different in Hungary than it was in Germany. According to my estimation, the reason is why this constitution is called fundamental law or basic law. It depends on the translation, because the drafters and the makers of the constitution believe that the real substantial constitution is the so-called historical constitution of Hungary, the medieval mythical constitution of Hungary, and this is only a written text which is a part of the which can be a part of the historical constitution. When the text of the fundamental law refers to the constitution as constitution, it refers to the historical constitution.
Ja, sonst noch Fragen, Anmerkungen? Well then, I have noted a question. When you talked about Hungarian failure, you said the failure is in adopting a formally new constitution. But if you look at the contents of the constitution, Hungary did adopt an entirely new text in 1989, 1990. In this respect, Hungary was the first country in the Eastern Bloc to have a new constitution as far as contents goes. So why is it a failure if you get the proper contents, just perhaps without the symbolic form around it?
Yeah. Difficult question. Yeah. We should distinguish formal terms and substantive terms. Substantively, the 1989 Constitution was brand new, but formally it wasn't new. It was a mere modification of the Stalinist Constitution. And many scholars believe, and I agree, that this substantially new Constitution should have changed by a formally new constitution adopted by a democratically elected parliament. The substantial revision in 1989 was made by a single-party parliament. It was not a legitimate procedure in substantive terms. Substantively, a legitimate constitution in a democratic regime is adopted by a representative body. This is why I call it a failure not to adopt a formally new constitution by a democratically elected parliament.
My question is a very general question. What kind of changes do you foresee for the future?
Future?
Yeah.
I believe law and constitutional law is only the surface. We can find sociological, political movements and phenomena behind this surface. So the answer to your question depends on political movements. In the short run, I'm not optimistic because of the political situation in Hungary and in Europe as well. There are disintegrative tendencies not only in Hungary but in Europe. There are populist movements, nationalist movements in Europe as well. So in the short run, I'm not optimistic, but on the long run, we have some ground for optimism because according to the recent polls, the large part of the Hungarian citizens still believe that a multi-party system is better than a single-party system, believe that a market economy is better than a state-run economy. They insist in democratic achievements. And Hungary is a secularized society with divergent beliefs, worldviews, and so on. So in the long run, we have some ground for optimism.
Why did you put a question mark behind the word free elections after 2011?
Yeah. Who knows what will happen in the next elections? Seriously, the governing coalition changed the procedural and substantive regulations on elections, on the general elections, and reshaped the constituencies. There was a gerrymandering in the Hungarian system. Changed the two-tier election system. Replaced the two-tier election system by a one-tier, largely disproportionate electoral system. And what happened? One of the democratic parties, who is one of the democratic parties changed alone the regulations, the rules of the contest, but the new regulation leaves place for democratic elections, but there are some problems with the practice of the electoral bodies, the electoral offices, and there are some warnings about the experts of the electoral system that makes difficult to estimate whether the next election and the upcoming elections will be totally free and fair elections. And much depends on the freedom of expression and the campaign regulations. Let me give you an example that the state as a whole and the state-run institutions and the state-run companies have privileges to initiate political campaigns and political advertisements in public media. It could make difficult to estimate whether the next elections will be free or not.
I have a rather political question. It was already when the new constitution was passed, I was so struck by this strong notion of Christian values and Christianity, and they could not explain it because Fidesz was not, I guess, still is not a truly Christian political party. It has no roots in Christian democracy. There was another Christian democratic party which now doesn't play any significant role anymore. And as you also mentioned the numbers, the level of religiosity in Hungary is not particularly high. So in Poland, it might earn you some votes if you mention in the constitution that you refer to Christian values. But in Hungary, it is not an election winner, I guess. So what is your take? How do you explain it?
Too,
is this
and I agree with your question.
By Orban, or?
I do not have any answer. What I know is that the opponents of the former constitution, the 1989 constitution, repeatedly emphasized that that constitution was substantially empty because it didn't contain any substantial values. I disagree with this because it contained the values of democracy, liberty, equality, rule of law, and democratic principles, but several scholars and politicians believe that it was not enough. Something substantial is needed, according to them.
Keine weiteren Fragen mehr. Well, yeah, we may not know about Hungary's far future, but I know about our very close future. So please join us on the invitation of the Graduate School and the Institute for East European Law to some drink and food outside, and we can continue our discussion there. Thank you very much.
Bulgarian wine.
Thank you very much.
I don't know about the origin of the wine. We'll see.